Stands in the name of the Leader of the Opposition, David Shearer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. To the Prime Minister. Does he stand by his statement, quote, "The test is whether I can rely on the member's word, and he has given me assurance that he met with the law. There is a statute of limitations and he has complied with the law."
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I stand by my full statement that the test is whether I can rely on the member's word, and he has given me an assurance that he met the law. The police have quite clearly said that there was insufficient evidence. There is a statute of limitations and he has complied with the law.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Does he accept the police findings, paragraph 40, that John Banks breached section 1342 of the Local Electoral Act?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I haven't seen the actual report. But funnily enough, I have seen the New Zealand Herald today where it said the police concluded that the report was false but could not prove that Mr Banks had known that when he signed it.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Does John Banks enjoy his confidence not because he breached the Act, but because he wasn't prosecuted for breaching the Act?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
He enjoys my confidence because I can rely on his word.
The Leader of the Opposition. Order. I want to hear the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Does he believe John Banks, or does he believe Simpson Grierson partner Greg Towers when he says in a sworn statement to police, quote, "John Banks said that as much as he wished to publicly support Kim, that may backfire on Kim if it became known about the election support." Given that Mr Towers would risk his career, including being disbarred as a lawyer, if he was found to be lying.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, it's quite possible that both men are right. I note in this morning's newspaper, the Dominion Post, it said that Greg Towers also told the police he was unaware of any donation from .com to Mr Banks's campaign. Support can take many forms. What I do know is that I've got a caucus that supports me, and that leader's got no support.
Order. The House will come to order. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Does he believe John Banks, or does he believe Kim?
I beg your pardon. Point of order, the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Mr Speaker, you will note that when you got to your feet, Mr Keith kept talking, but the sound system for him did not go off. Right? So I want to know what's going on here, because you told us that was a practice around this part.
Order. I'm sure had he kept going, it would have gone off. The Leader of the Opposition.
Does he believe John Banks, or does he believe Kim.com when he says in a sworn statement to police that he offered Mr Banks $50,000? Quote, "Mr Banks immediately accepted my offer," end quote, and that, quote, "Mr Banks then said to me that it would be better to split it into 2 cheques for $25,000. He told me it was because then he would not have to declare where it came from."
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I'm not in a position to assess the merits of that, but what I do know is the Local Electoral Act, as it was designed by the Labor Party, or at least not changed by them, made it quite legal for someone to solicit a donation and, in fact, to ask a donor how to give those donations anonymously. And I'll be pretty sure the Labor Party did that under the old laws for general elections all the time.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Does he believe John Banks, or does he believe Wayne Tempero when he says in a sworn statement to police that he remembers John Banks saying, quote, "No, not 1 cheque, write 2 cheques out for $25,000 each"?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I'm just not in a position to judge that, but I accept John Banks at his word.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Speaker, in the interest of having a transparent ministry, will he ask John Banks to release his witness statement?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, that's not something I have ministerial responsibility for.
Point of order, the Honourable Trevor Mallard.
Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister asking someone one of his ministers to release a document is something he has ministerial responsibility for when it goes to the ethics of that minister.
Order. The Prime Minister doesn't have responsibility for that document, and Prime Minister is perfectly entitled to answer that way. The point of order, the Honourable David Parker.
He doesn't have responsibility for that document. We're not saying that he has responsibility for that document, but he does have responsibility for the integrity of his ministries, and it is within his power and responsibility as to whether or not he chooses to ask for that statement.
Well, order. The Prime Minister has given one answer to one question. It's not beyond the wit of members to devise more questions to test the Prime Minister further on the matter. Point of order, the Honourable David.
If the Prime Minister had said, "I'm not wanting and willing to do that," that would have been an answer that would have addressed the question. But to say that he hasn't got ministerial responsibility and therefore doesn't have to answer the question is, with respect, wrong.
I'll hear the Honourable Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, the convention that Mr Key, as Prime Minister, is entitled to rely on was well established by Helen Clark in the middle period of 2002, just prior to that year's election, when in fact she was in a situation of having considerable disruption due to the breakdown of the alliance, which was a party in the House at the time, and made it very clear that there are quite strong distinctions between a Prime Minister and dealing with the ministerial responsibilities of ministers, and a Prime Minister as a leader dealing with the leadership or other issues relating to any other party. And Mr Speaker, the Hansard will record all of that. I believe Speaker's rulings have been relied on, particularly by Speaker Hunt in the past, and there is no case being made by the opposition in this matter.
Well, I hear the Honourable
Mr Speaker, I'd like to refer to the precedent of Dr. the Honourable Lockwood Smith and his questioning of Helen Clark on the Taito Phillip Field matter, where there were a number of documents which had to do with the Commission, which was not her responsibility, that he questioned her about, and Sir, the Speaker did not protect Helen Clark in those circumstances.
Order. The Speaker happens to have a reasonable memory of those matters, and following certain events yesterday checked up on a number of those matters very exhaustively. And in fact, if the member's memory is serving him well, he'll recollect that in fact the government commissioned an investigation that the member has raised a number of questions around that document. That is a totally different matter. This is not a document that the government has commissioned. The Honourable David Parker.
My recollection of those events, sir, was that the points that you were making in your questions was that the inquiries did not go far enough, and so you had leeway to ask the Prime Minister as to what other information was available that ought to be taken into account by the Prime Minister in judging the situation.
Order. No, order. We don't need to take this any further. The member should know I do my homework. Order. I do my homework very thoroughly. All the Hansards have been scrutinised from that period, I can assure the honourable member. And the questions are related, in fact, to content of that government-commissioned report. Now, there are further supplementaries can be asked, but the answer the Prime Minister gave to that particular question is not an unreasonable answer, because the Prime Minister doesn't have responsibility for that particular document. Well, I've dealt with this matter, so I hope it's a new point of order.
Of order, Mr Speaker.
The Honourable David Parker.
Mr Speaker, I would ask you to go through those Hansards again, because I think that what you just said to the House is not correct. You said that all of the questions to the Prime Minister arose out of what was in the report. I have a clear recollection of those times, sir, and your questions were addressing what was not addressed in those reports, which was one of your main criticisms at the time.
Order. We're not going to take this matter any further. The member is litigating a matter I've already ruled on, and I suggest he does go back and look at it as carefully as I have. The Leader of the Opposition, does he wish to ask further supplementary question?
Is the handling of the John Banks case consistent with his undertaking to lift the standard of ethics in government?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, one level, yes, because that wouldn't be hard compared to the previous government. At a second level, let me summarise the situation. My office has relied on the word of the member. The police in their statement have made it quite clear there was insufficient evidence. The police have also made it quite clear that while the return may have been false, they could not prove that John Banks had known it was signed in that particular way, and we know that the law was very loose. So while the Labor Party might think this is the biggest issue...
No order. There's been sufficient answer. Point of order. Point of order, Grant Robertson, and will be heard in silence.
Mr. Speaker, I seek leave of the House to table paragraphs 39 and 40 of the police report, which says that the police conclude that the elements of section 1342 were met for a prosecution on Mr. Banks.
Leave is sought to table that or those pages from that document. Is there any objection? There is no objection. Question number 2, Paul Goldsmith. I beg your pardon. I missed Materia Ture. I do apologise. Supplementary question, Materia Ture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and happy Suffrage Day to you, sir. Does the Prime Minister accept the finding of fact?
Materia Ture, supplementary question.
Does the Prime Minister accept the finding of fact in the police report of 26 July 2012 that, quote, police have established that on the 9th of June 2010, Mr. John Banks personally solicited a donation from Mr. Kim.com, end quote?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not in a position to judge that, but I know that the local electoral law, the way it's crafted, would mean that that is quite legal to do that. See, if members don't like other members complying with the law, they're free to think that way, but actually the test is whether you meet the law.
Materia Ture.
Point of order, sir.
Point of order.
The question was very clear. The Prime Minister has said previously that he read that particular report and he has not addressed the question, which was very simple. Does he agree with the police finding of fact that John Banks solicited a donation from Kim.com from a report he has read? He has not addressed that question.
Well, the Prime Minister answered the question insofar as he pointed out that to have done that is perfectly legal under the current Act. And I think, you know, he doesn't have to agree with the member, but he pointed out that there's nothing wrong with having done that under the current law. Supplementary question, the Honourable. I beg your pardon, I must come back to Materia Ture first.
Point of order, sir.
Point of order, Materia Ture.
I seek leave to table a copy of the 2012 26 July report from the police stating that the police have established that John Banks personally solicited a donation from Kim.com.
Leave is sought to table that document. Is there any objection? There is no objection. Supplementary question, Materia Ture.
Did John Banks tell the Prime Minister or his office earlier this year that he was not aware that Kim.com made a donation to his mayoral campaign?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, as I was told the House earlier, Mr. Banks assured me through my Chief of Staff that he fully complied with the requirements of the legislation.
Order. Before I go back to Honourable Member, that's not exactly the question asked. The member may repeat a question if there's some doubt as to that. Materia Ture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Did John Banks tell the Prime Minister or his office earlier this year that he was not aware that Kim.com made a donation to his mayoral campaign?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I wasn't party to the conversation, but to the best of my knowledge, he was unaware of donations that were made. That's why they're anonymous. At the end of the day, you can solicit them and you can have your own supposition, but it doesn't mean that you actually don't.
Materia Ture, supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Doesn't the Prime Minister think that if John Banks was being genuinely honest with him, that he would have told him that he solicited a donation from Mr. Kim.com as the police found in their finding of facts?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, no, I don't think you can draw that conclusion. What you can draw as a conclusion from the police was two things. One, that there was insufficient evidence, and secondly, while the return was false, the police themselves said they could not prove that Mr. Banks had known that when he signed it because it was put together by another individual who Mr. Banks relied on.
Materia Ture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Isn't the Prime Minister's denial just him dancing on the head of a pin when most New Zealanders believe that John Banks was dishonest in his communication to the Prime Minister? And aren't New Zealanders right to expect more from the Prime Minister?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
No, but I think there's a genuine misunderstanding of what's actually permissible under the Local Electoral Act.
The Honourable David Parker.
In light of that answer and the answer about 3 supplementary questions before, is it the Prime Minister's position that it is legal under the existing local electoral donation laws for a member to solicit a donation, for a member to know that a donation was made by someone who they solicited it from, but then to declare that it was anonymous?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, you're asking, the member's asking a legal opinion, and I'm not in a position to offer that, but what I can say, my understanding of the way that was put by that member, that would not be legal. It's quite legal to go and to ask for support. It's quite legal to give indications of how that could be made anonymously. But in the end, the point there, of course, is one never really knows. There were many donations made, as I can see from newspaper reports, for $25,000. It's impossible to know who they came from. Lots of people tell organisations that they will give money. They don't necessarily always do so.
Point of order, Grant Robertson.
Mr. Speaker, I seek leave of the House to table paragraph 38 of the police report that states, further analysis in respect of the evidence collected in the investigation established that the return was wrong and content, and that the donations from skycity.com should not have been recorded as anonymous.
The leavers sought to table that page from that document. Is there any objection?
There is.
There is objection. The Right Honourable Winston Peters, supplementary question. Order. Order. I want to hear the order. I must be able to hear the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Yes. Does the Prime Minister accept that the police report says that the elements for a prosecution were established? And if so, then why is he claiming in this House to be able to trust Mr Banks's word?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I haven't seen the report, so it's possible. I do know that the police statement that they put out that summarised the report said a couple of things. One, there is insufficient evidence, but also what I also know from the report this morning was that the police concluded that the return was false. So on that basis, yes, the member may have some validity there, but they could not prove that Mr Banks had known that when he signed it. What the police are quite clearly saying is that on the main charge of whether there could be a position where that the situation was knowingly by Mr Banks false, there's no claim of that by the police.
Supplementary question. The Right Honourable Winston Peters.
If you have 42 donations, all of which were anonymous, all of which were forgotten, would you then trust that man's word in this House if he gave it to you?
Order. The Speaker shouldn't be involved in the question that way. I invite the Right Honourable gentleman to reword his question.
If the Prime Minister is aware that there were 42 donations, all of which were substantial, all of which were anonymous, that means the whole lot were all regarded as being anonymous, why would then the Prime Minister trust the word of Mr Banks on this issue?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, the question at heart is whether the member complied with the law. That's the assurance he's given my office, and I accept that.
Grant Robertson, supplementary
Further
question.
to that answer, does the Prime Minister understand that filing a false return is a breach of the Local Electoral Act, and that is what the police have found that Mr Banks did?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
It could be, Mr Speaker, but as the police themselves said, well, it could be, but as the police said, it's a lesser offence and it was outside the period of time. They also went on to say, that while they concluded that the return was false, they could not prove that Mr Banks had known that. So if you want to go after the person that put it together, that might be right, but not Mr Banks.
Question number 2, Paul Goldsmith.
Speaker, my question is to the Minister.